So what we're going to do today is I want to make show how to make some animate and inanimate forms to be used in making ceramic forms, and use them in making them so the techniques can be applied to making the narrative sculpture project, where you're telling a story, combining inanimate objects or animate objects, or a combination of animate and inanimate objects. Inanimate objects would be things like toys, cars, bottles. These would be all inanimate objects. Content-wise, if you're telling a story, these all perhaps could have different meanings. An automobile, for example, we use automobiles on a daily basis, or some people do anyway. But that has content. It's a means of transportation. If it's an older car, it might be about time. Here's a dog, like an archetypal dog, or I guess it's a wolf, but we could use this for making a dog because and anatomically there's some similar things. A pig, cow, and then there's things which are kind of in between animate and inanimate. This is a heart, but it's actually a fairly accurate representation of a heart. You know it is, like a human heart. Here's a brain. And then we have things like flowers. Flower, what could this be a symbol of? Maybe love, depending upon how you use it. A skull, right? Skull, oftentimes it's a symbol of death. And then there are things which, depending upon, they really don't make sense until you use them. Like this is an archetypal dog bone. There's no doubt. There's nothing else that's really like that. But how this could be used, I don't know. It just depends. Here's an acorn. Like that's probably an archetypal symbol, maybe from nature. This is part of a set of dice. I think of dice. I think of the idea of chance or gambling, maybe. A shoe, maybe walking, or from going one place to another. This is an iron. An iron, like maybe a symbol of domesticity. So it's a classic household form that people use, especially if you have to get dressed up on a daily basis. This is a different kind of shoe. It's an athletic shoe. It's a set of cleats. So this is going to mean something slightly different than this. And you could go on. So what I'm doing is going to take a couple of these things and make them. The first thing I want to do is take some shapes, and oftentimes in ceramics, if you're going to make something, you don't want to make it more than an inch thick. So ultimately, you either need to hollow it out to begin with or hollow it out later. So I could make something solid, but eventually I have to go back in there when it's leather hard before it dries, cut it in half and hollow it out. So what I'm going to do now is just make a simple spherical shape. And what I've done is I've squeezed this, and I'm making a simple pinch pot. So I show pinch pots every semester to my ceramic class. And what I'm doing is squeezing, and as I'm doing that, I'm squeezing the wall's going up, and then I'm going to turn and allow this to go inward. So as I'm squeezing this, the wall's getting thicker and it's going upward. So what I want to do ultimately is to close this hole off and seal it completely. And that's going to lock air in there, almost like a basketball or football, that if you seal it completely, it's not going to deflate, right? It doesn't have holes in it. So any ball is like that. Okay. So I'm bringing this around carefully. And again, I want to stretch this wall out, keeping it kind of round. And then I'm going to bring this in. As I'm bringing it in, see the wall's getting thicker. I'm going to stretch this some more. I'm going to see how round I can get that. And once it gets to about less than an inch, you can just pretty much go in, squeeze it. If you want that to stay shut, it's a good idea just to go in there and just score that a little bit, the inside, the interior of that. So it stays, and that'll avoid it cracking later. All right, so I have that. So if I were to make something out of this, what I would do is, once it's plastic, what I'd want to do is rough out the shape as much as I can. So let's say I'm making something like a peach. I think that's a peach, roughly. So with a peach, it's got one end that's kind of tapered, right? So I would show that a little bit. And then it's the other end, it's got a place where the stem is, right? So I would slowly poke my hand in there. And then I would find something that's pointy, but maybe not too pointy. Take that, and I'm going to rotate that. Perfect. So I have several tools around the studio. Some are like commercial tools that you can buy. Some of my best tools, actually, I've just made myself. Most of these paddles here are made from bits of furniture, then I've just sanded them to make them flat or spherical or a combination of the two or a specific shape. So then I'm going to take peaches have that. They have that distinct corner there. I might even be able to do this on the table. There we go, that's working. So there's going to be a limit as to how far I can go with this, because I can still move the walls. So what I'm going to do is let this dry. So this is another shape. This is a little harder than the peach I just made. And what I'm going to do is make a lemon. The lemon is, some lemons are a little bit more oval. They're more of an ovoid shape. Some are more rounded. So I think when you look at any form, certain forms have tells, to tell what they are. Like the minute I go like that, it starts to become more lemon-like. And then I'm going to round this off. And then it's got a stem. So the stem, I can make the stem just by taking, let's see, something that's kind of rounded. I could use this. This is just an ice cream stick. So something like an ice cream tape, I can sand this and actually customize this and actually make a simple tool. You can make great tools, just things like skewer sticks or chopsticks. This is just a chopstick. So the other thing that makes something a lemon is the yellow. Like that color is actually an important part. So I have it roughly shaped out. It does help to have the actual shape in front of you. So having an actual lemon, this probably be the first suggestion if somebody was making a lemon. But then with some shapes, like texture is really important. So for example, apples and bananas and peaches are slightly fuzzy. But lemons, anything citrus, oranges, grapefruit, limes, they have texture, and it's a really fine texture. So I'm going to see how this works. This is just a part of a wire brush. And I would just make that, my goal here is to make this dense enough so it's somewhat convincing. It's definitely getting transformed. I'm not sure if this is a lemon texture or not, but okay. Let's do one more. We'll do an apple this time. So one of the tools that you can use, besides your hands for shaping things, once it gets a little harder and it's sealed, is you can take a paddle. So the beauty about a paddle is if you keep turning it, you can make things kind of round if you keep turning it. You also can make flat sides. You can use a table too for making flat sides. But since apples do not have flat sides, we're going to focus on making this rounded. It helps us this is just slightly dry. So this has been drying for a little bit. So like I said, this was pinched and then sealed. And what I'm going to make is just like an archetypal apple that you'd see, maybe a Honey Crisp or delicious apple. Maybe it's a little narrower down here. I'm going to try to smooth this out. So if I want to smooth this, remember I can go back to some of my tools here. I'll start it here. I can use a metal rib. If I want to get this, if it's leather hard and you want to get this really even, you can use a Surform. Surform will actually make the walls thinner. So it's a Surform's a little bit messy because you wind up with all these little scraps that you have to move later, but they work pretty well, and they're really good for making the walls a little thinner. So ultimately, if you're making anything that we're going to fire in the studio, we don't really want it too much thicker than 3/4 of an inch. Not only is it not an efficient use of clay, but it's more likely to crack or even blow up in the firing. So we want to avoid thick areas of any form that we make, whether they're sculptural or made in the ceramics 1 class. Okay, so now I can take this. Remember, all the scrap clay, we don't throw anything in the garbage. That all gets recycled. Reclaim that. All right, so I can refine that with a metal rip, right? I'm pushing my thumb in there like that. And then I'm alternating this, and eventually this will get rounded. All right, and now, so like that peach that I made earlier, I'm going to slowly put my thumb in there, just get it started. So oftentimes when I'm making something, I don't try to refine one area all at once. What I try to do is rough out the shape. So my mind, the lemon had this little bump at the end, and then the stem on the other, and then the texture. So like all those things, like that stem, the slightly oval shape, Those were sort of the tells. It's the same thing here. So with the apple, it's kind of, in my shape, a lot of, some, not apples, they're not all the same shape. In my mind, the type of apple I was making, it's kind of almost heart shape, right? And then it's got a stem, and the part where the stem goes in, it goes in gradually. So if you're making something gradual, if you want it to go in gradual, what you can do is take a cloth, put it over the part you want it to go in if you don't want to carve it out, and then push this in, and this will pull the cloth in a little bit. See that? And nice how that works. And if I can look at it, if I need to do more, I just keep doing this. And what's happening is the cloth is distributing the pressure, so you're not poking a hole through it. So I can, if I want to make that a little slicker, I can take my wet leather, make that smoother. Remember, if you're wetting the clay down, be careful because you're weakening the clay, and you might also eliminate some surface details that you want, that you've put on previously. Okay, then so maybe the bottom, that bottom's important. I'm gonna maybe do a little, it's kind of irregular. And what I remember, for like certain apples, is especially delicious apples, they have that. There's like a little bumpy part of the form which is asymmetrical. When I was growing up, there was only a couple of different types of apples. Now they have all these different apples that they've hybrids. Okay. So subtlety make a difference. Apples, oftentimes they don't sit perfect. You know, maybe off to the side. I'm going to take a little piece of clay. I'm going to roll that. And I'm going to make a little stem. There's an apple. Okay, so let's make a different shape. Content. Right now, we're going through the coronavirus, right? So these are some shapes I made the other day. What I did was I simply took a hollow ball and I pinched little shapes on it like this. And then I added clay. Remember that if you add clay, it's important to slip and score. So if you slip and score, anything that's leather hard, you can either use a needle tool, a scratchy tool, or a sharp comb. Because if I just simply take wet clay and I add it, it's going to come off. But if I score it with slip, the clay will adhere. Right? So if I were doing this, I would slip and score the areas that I'm going to add clay, and I would just take bits of clay the size of small grapes, and then I pinch them back and forth on here. And then I would start to smooth them out. So now a lot of these are the lemon and the apple here. Those are pretty much made to scale, but I'd hate to think what would happen if coronaviruses were really this big, huh? But these are sort of interesting shapes because you know it's like the synthesis between like a gum tree pod and a harbor mine, some exotic fruit. Pollen also looks like this shape too, maybe a sea urchin. So they're kind of compelling shapes. But what I've done here is I've played with scale. So I think I have a picture of an animated coronavirus. There's one right there. That's just a reference point. So if you're making things, feel free, and you can't get an actual form, feel free to use pictures by all means. But just remember, there's subtle things that you see in the picture that can't get it. But so what I want to do is just maybe put some of the things in this. I mean, no matter where you go right now, you can't get rid of you can't get coronavirus. So what I'm going to do is take this. This is kind of between plastic and leather hard, and I'm going to I want to do something different to each one of these. So this one, I'm going to put holes at the tip, because it looks like, in the end here, they almost look like flowers. I've seen like a few different, several different pictures of coronaviruses. They're interestingly enough, every one is slightly different. It's interesting how people animate them. I know they have pictures that are taken from electron scanning microscopes, and those are pretty accurate, but it's also interesting to see how people render these. So this changes a little bit by having these little openings. One thing, if you're doing something out of ceramics and you have thin appendages that stick out too much, they're going to break. These are actually very manageable. These are not too thin. Make sure if you make something that's enclosed that you have a hole that goes all the way through. So we have a few that go through. Okay, we're going to jump back to that. Let's do something different to this one maybe. So this is theme and variation. I'm not sure how I would use this in telling a story, but like I said, it's got plenty of content. So let's see here. I noticed on this animation, it looks like the little appendages are kind of, they almost look like flowers. You know, so there's a part of me that would like to try one, actually, like to make them almost look like flowers. So I'm going to show you flowers in a little bit. But let's try something different. So I'm going to take the same idea, but we're going to make those holes a little bit different. So part of being an artist is trying stuff. So once you feel comfortable, like making a shape, feel free maybe to alter it somehow. Now, one thing I will say about these are probably of the forms on this table, this is probably the most abstract. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my shirt here. I'm going to take this Phillips head. Let's see what happens. Not bad. Let's see that. It's not bad either. That looks more mechanical. What I like about that is it's less like a Phillips head. So I'm going to take that. How many people that work at this college can say they get to do this with their clothing? Okay. Again, the reason why I'm doing that, it makes it look less mechanical, makes it look a little bit more organic, and less like a Phillips head screw head. So I'm getting back and looking at this if I want to emphasize this more. I'm making these so they're more star-shaped. So what I'm doing is just emphasizing that cross mark that the Phillips made. I'm emphasizing that a little bit more. So I tell my students that whenever you're looking at something, you can find something that's working, to identify what's working. A common critique, the three questions I always ask at critiques are what's working, what's not working, and what can you do to make it better. Another way is once you see what's working, what's not working, is you can sometimes boil things down to accentuate or eliminate. So what I'm doing here is accentuating those holes a little bit. Okay, so let's pick another object out. So this is a hollow form. It was a heart again loaded in terms of content, right? So what I did was I roughed out an oval shape, and then I pinched out and added some of the valves. And what I'm going to do is just accentuate some of the parts, give it some detail to make it a little bit more convincing. So on this, this is like a little squeezy toy, a thing for hearts, like an exercise thing from like Heart Institute. But what I'm going to do is just take something, maybe something round. Let's see. This might work. We'll try that. And then there's parts to the heart. I think there's even small veins and stuff that if I want to make that more convincing, I can. So when you're doing this, like a thinner material works better. So there's little things I can do just to make this more convincing. I could keep working on that. But as long as it stays leather hard, as long as it stays leather hard, I can keep working on that. That's a heart there. This was I made this a little while ago. So this is a conch shell. So I took kind of the archetypal conch shell. And I think it's useful to actually have objects to look at. So this is the reason why when people are figure drawing, you have a live model. The beauty about inanimate objects is you can use them any time of day, and you don't have to pay them. But when I'm looking at it, is what I would do is when I'm doing this, I'm making this maybe a little bit larger. But I look at it at different angles. So I'd look at it straight down. I'd look at it from the back. I'd look at it from the front. And I would see what I need to do. So in all these shapes that I'm making, I start with the shape. And then I could either pinch, manipulate the shape, and get it roughly the geometric shape. And after I do that, I can either carve clay off, remove clay, or I can add it. Just remember, if it's rather hard, we have to slip and score. So if I were going to add more clay to this, right, I would make sure I slip and score, and then I can add freely. So you have a whole area you need to add clay. Just make sure you slip and score it, and you can add it. Okay, so most of what we've done so far, when you're working with clay, I'd say when you're making anything, initially it's all additive. So you're modeling. Modeling is when you use your hands just to kind of basically shape something. When you're doing this, you're adding, right? So this is adding. If I'm adding and pinching and shaping, that's modeling. So modeling is kind of when you're manipulating the clay to make a specific form, right? So, and oftentimes when you're modeling, it's additive. Modeling is kind of additive and subtractive. So you're adding some clay, maybe moving some clay, taking it away, but that's modeling. But this, I would say a lot of what I'm doing right now is additive modeling. So what I'm trying to do is I'm adding this, I'm looking at this, and I'm breaking this shape down. Oh, the front of this is a cone, and it's got these little bumps on it that go around in a spiral. So I'm taking that. And then I work, as I do this, I work on different shapes, different parts. And I don't worry about smoothing until I have the form roughed out. That's really, really important. So an analogy would be is if you were doing a drawing in the drawing class, before you start doing any of the shading or rendering detail on anything in the room or in a still life, you would get the perspective right. So if you were doing a still life, you'd make sure you get the plane correct and get all the kind of the shapes correct and respect all the planes and how the objects are sitting there. That would go first before you start rendering details. It's the same thing here. I'd get roughly the shape here done. I'd get the shape done first, and then I would start putting details in. But it's important to keep turning the object. Now, if you're working from a photograph, it gets a little bit trickier, because when you're working from a photograph, oftentimes you have one view. So what I tell people when they're making a head, like doing a self-portrait of a head, first thing I say is, if you're doing a self-portrait or a portrait of a head of somebody else, get a picture of the head from 6 different angles. Front, back, right side, left side, top view. So, and that enables you to render it more accurately three-dimensionally. Okay, so I'm just getting this. Okay, so I could keep working on this, but because this is a little bit stiff, I can enable to do that. It's not going to collapse. Here's another shape that I started, and it was a hand, right? It's a right hand. And what I did was, I took a piece of clay, and I flattened it out. I hope I don't get coronavirus from that. Okay. And I made it a little bit thicker than my hand. Right? This would work well for a self-portrait because I would be using my own hand, right? All right, or narrative, sorry. I take my hand, go there, and what I would do is just trace that out. Trace that. Left hand, right hand. I'll do a left hand this time. And so I find something, I can trace it. Cut it out. If I were drawing a hand, and I did this in a drawing class, I think I'd probably get into trouble. All right. But this is useful just for getting proportions, and many people that take the sculpture class too are not art majors, so oftentimes they don't take drawing 1, which would be useful. So what I'm doing is I'm roughing this out, right? So how I made this was I spread this out. And I put this around the ball like that. And then I let it set up, right? So I'm using like a mold. This would be a story about maybe somebody playing ball when they were younger. Or maybe it's a story about an historic baseball player, you know. Like Jackie Robinson, right? Okay, so once I have this done now, I can start to refine this and I can look at my hand and start to render things like the knuckles, or what are the tells in the fingers? The first tell I can think of would be like a fingernail. So here. This is a great tool for modeling. It's like a tapered rubber tool. They're not cheap, but they work really well for modeling. Let's see here. There's something else I'm looking for. Here it is. I'm looking to see what my thumb looks like when I do that. Let's make that a little bit smaller. It's a large hand. Okay, so again, like if it's a little bit thick, I can remove some clay. The next thing I'm looking at with the finger is if I go like that, like with my hand, there's actually, you can break each finger down into 3 components, right? So it's 1, 2, 3, and then the volume, kind of the planar volume of the hand. So I'm going to break that down. 1, where the joints are. 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And each one of those is almost a corner there. So what I would do is keep trimming this down and then rolling and showing some of the little wrinkles where the joints are. I guess these become more distinct when you get older. But it's adding and taking away. Let's try doing some smaller things. Most, the hand is close to life size, the heart's pretty close, apples, fruit. The coronavirus is here. We're all, larger, right? But it wouldn't really be practical to make a full-size car. But like, if I made a car, this might be a little bit small to make out of clay. I'd rough that out, and then I'd put the details of the window. But I might make that twice the size. So you think if you're making if your sculpture is telling a story, think about the scale you want, and that's going to dictate how big the object's. But if there's an object you want to emphasize, it might be larger, right? So what I'm going to do is just pinch out. Let's try making an animal. So we have a polar bear. Polar bear is a loaded symbol right now, right? So I would say it's not as talked about as the coronavirus right now, but certainly it's kind of the poster child for climate change in the Arctic. So what I'm going to do is make the body, and then I'm going to pinch or squeeze out 4 legs, because polar bears are quadrupeds. And those are great. These are great forms. They're actual. Their shapes. They have beautiful contours. They're hydrodynamic because they swim, even though they have all that fur. Their hair is actually, they're white because their hair is hollow. They actually don't have white. Their hair is not white per se. It's just that the hair in their fur is hollow, so that's why it's white. Just a little fun fact there. Okay, so what I'm doing is pinching this out, and I'm going to make a polar bear. The nice thing about a polar bear's legs, too, is that they're thicker, so they're not as likely to break. So for example, if I was making a cow for some reason, or any kind of animal with thin legs, whether it's a dog or a cat, the problem with this is that in clay it's going to break. So if I made a cow, design-wise, or a dog or a cat, I probably might be better off having the dog sitting, or sleeping or something, or sitting up. And if it has thinner legs. And in doing that, I avoid it breaking. So I'm going to pinch this out. So basically what I'm doing is I'm pinching out 5 appendages, 1 for the head. And I'm not, because this is relatively small, and the clay's still wet, I can just pinch and add freely. So right now I've got something with 4 legs. And it's amazing, if you pinch one way, it turns into a horse. You pinch another way, it can turn into a cat. All right, so this needs more body because they have a lot of body. So you'll notice this is solid. If I were to keep this, I'd have to hollow this out somehow. So I'd either need to cut it in half. Something you could do, just to get it started, is here's a technique, is you take the body, you shape it around a cylindrical form that's tapered, right? I'm going to squeeze that around. Actually can make the shape here a little bit too. And I can use this So I'm looking at the ears. The ears are like half circles. So the nice thing about these plastic toys, you can get these at like Hobby Lobby or Michael's, and as you use your Wednesday 40% off coupon, you can get them pretty cheap, like very, very reasonably. But a lot of them are fairly accurate in terms of anatomy, you know, whether they're farm animals or wild animals, and they're good models, and you can use that in conjunction with photocopies, like or images off on your cell phone. It's just that on a screen, you're only getting one view, and it's really hard to get a sense of subtlety and details on a two-dimensional surface, whether it's a photocopy or a screen of some kind. I'm going to lay this down. So again, it's just, all I'm doing is roughing this out, and then I'm going to worry about details later. And when I'm working, I'm constantly turning it. I'm just pinching. The worst thing you can do when you're starting out is to begin smoothing immediately. And again, it's sort of like drawing, where you want to get the composition done first before you begin rendering the shapes and putting shadows and details and stuff in. So I'm just making sure I have lots of clay here. Their legs are pretty long, I think, relative to other species of bears. All right, so now I've got this almost roughed out. Maybe just a few more bits of clay in places. I'm going to pull this out, add just maybe a little bit more clay back here. And I can use this to seal it off. So I'm going to pull this out so it's hollow. Take this, and I'm going to squeeze this just like I did earlier when I was making the fruit, the coronavirus models. So we can actually have shape and fun with this too, where this could, the bear could maybe be sitting, could be standing. I can turn it. Right? If I want to make eyes, there's a little trick I'll show you. Just take two little pieces of clay, roll them like the size of peas, place them in there. Let's see here. I want to get this to sit. Let's say I have to do something like this. I have to get that to turn upright that way. Here. This can be. Standing on top of the heart. Let's do a couple more. If I have that flower there, sometimes you can make things in pieces. So to make a flower, I would make it just how the flower is constructed. I would take a thin piece of cloth, like a piece of canvas, and then what I would do is roll out a series of oval shapes. So these would be like a large grape, and then make a series of these. And they might go from small to large, just like the petals. So the petals on the inside are smaller of the flower. Rose. Roses are not, like this works well because they're not going to break. If I were making something like a daisy or like a coneflower, that would be more problematic because the petals would break as they stick out. But the idea is if you're making something, try to get the parts so they're contained so it does not break. So that's a design problem, like when you're making the form. So in the narrative sculpture, what I ask people to do is to take you're telling a story. Here's an example of somebody, this is made of earthenware. So this was a piece somebody had done. And so he made a box, it was like a plinth. And then he made a figure. The figure's looking at a cell phone, and then he has these other objects around it, and they're kind of melting. I think these are other screens and stuff. But the figure becomes important because of the plinth that he put on it. It's almost like a monolith. And then the figure also it kind of morphs, like how it's looking. It's morphing from the screen or the tablet it's looking at into its face. So you don't see the face. So it's a compelling piece, I think. And it was done it was a narrative sculpture assignment. So what he did was he rendered the box and then some of the objects. But then he wanted to just get a really basic human figure. So it's a figure, it looks like it's probably a man, but you know it's human. It's definitely not like any of the animals on this table or fruit or anything else. All right, so now what I'm going to do is take the canvas, roll this, and I'm going to flatten out a series of right, so this is tapered. So it's pointing on one end, and I'm just taking my palm, flattening it out. So the nice thing about this is you get a tapered edge, just like a real leaf or a flower petal. So tapered. And that's actually going, my palm has got, it's almost like it works really well as a bowl because it's slightly concave and it makes a really good press for doing this. So I'm going to start in the middle if I'm making this flower, right? And I'm looking at the flower and I'm seeing how that kind of curls into a bud. And what I want to do is not mess with the top too much. And I'm just building it up. I'm not going to worry about slipping and scoring because this will hold together. This should hold together. And I probably could have made these petals a little bit thinner, but these will work. So one of the things is when you're working this way, the less you touch it, the better. Because if I try to mess with that too much, I'm going to lose the flower quality it has. And all I'm doing is just building up. Look at that. All right, so then when I'm done, it's got that little thing at the bottom. I could add those little triangular things. Triangular leaves, they call them. And it looks like there's half a dozen or so, but I'll put a few on just so you can kind of get the idea. But I'm going to do the same thing. But these are shaped, they're shaped differently. They're definitely more elongated and triangular. And then these would be slipped and scored, you know, if I were adding these. Okay? Now, the stem on here would not be practical. Like, I could do a little bit of it, but this would have to be supported with something else. Okay, so there. And then once it's there, I could manipulate these so they look like they have more movement, like a real flower. Okay, so these are a couple of forms that I roughed out. This is an iron, just roughed out, but and then we have a book, right? So this is leather hard. This has been like drying for an hour. But what I'd want to do is just show some of the detail on it. So what I'm going to do now is I have it roughed out. I'm just going to put some of the detail. So I'm going to take a sure form here. And the book, there's the binding side, which is kind of round. So what I'm going to do is just roll that just a little bit. I could also maybe use like a paddle. Just round that a little bit. And then there's the corner there where the binding is. I'll maybe show that a little bit. Last fall, somebody for this project did a narrative, and what they did was they were relatively young, you know, like many of the people in the class. So they says, well, what am I, you know, I don't know I'm so young, what am I going to like make a story about? And I said, well, you can make a story about something else. No, I want to do something about myself. And I says, well, maybe you could, you're 19 years old, 20. Why don't you make a story about your youth? So what they did was they took all the books, their favorite books from their youth, and they stacked the books up. So they made probably 6-8 books from different sizes, kind of like this. They were hollow, and then they stacked them up, you know, staggering them along the way, and then using colored slips, they put the titles using the actual graphics. So they took the graphics, and then they photocopied, they placed them on there, and they used colored slips, and they stacked them up, and then the stack of books created a stage, kind of a plinth. And then on here, they told a story. I think there was a couple of figures dancing, and there may have been like some toys. But anything they could there, the whole thing is that the books told the story, like it alluded to their youth, and then the objects told the rest of the story that were on top. It was really a great piece, especially for someone who never had many, who had little art, just a few art classes, really. All right, so what I'm going to do now is just put some of the other detail to the binding, right? And again, I wouldn't be able to do this if the clay was wet. And if I wanted to give more information, I could put the title of the book there, right? But right now, it's just more of a symbol like a book. Like, if I made this black, maybe it could be a Bible, or I actually could put Bible there, right? So I could put more information on this to make this more specific.